Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second episode of UPE Podcast. UPE Podcast is a new series for UPE members by UPE members. Each episode, we will have an amazing guest on the air as they share their stories, experiences, and insights for all of our listeners' pleasure. My name is Arpit, Jasapara, and I'll be your host today. I am joined by Benjamin Hendricks, an esteemed UPE UCLA alumni. Ben, it is great to have you here. How are you doing?
Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Can't complain. All right, then without further ado, let's jump into some of the questions. So Ben, we understand that you're a staff software engineer at LinkedIn. Could you tell us a bit more about how you ended up getting into LinkedIn?
Definitely. So I actually started like you as an intern at LinkedIn. I was an intern in 2014. Back then it was just a mobile team that I was a part of. LinkedIn now doesn't have a mobile team. There's mobile engineers sprinkled throughout the entire organization. Um, and and that's what led me to then get a full-time offer at the end of that internship. So that's what led me to come back. My path at LinkedIn was then kind of interesting though, because I was there for a year full-time and then actually left the company and came back. So what they call a boomerang. But so I've been at LinkedIn in three kind of separate stints of internship, first full year full-time work, and then I've been there now for 2.5 years in the New York office.
Awesome. And another question is, what made you decide on LinkedIn, especially when you got your full-time offer after your internship, and what made it unique, or did you apply anywhere else?
Sure. Yeah. So my LinkedIn internship is actually my third internship at big company. So I had an intern at Google the summer before and Apple the summer before that. And so that gave me a really good kind of comparison set, right, to see where I wanted to go. While I didn't actually apply anywhere else because I was so happy with my LinkedIn internship and knew I wanted to come back. But I know that I could have secured return offers from Apple or Google if I tried. So I did have that in the back of my mind. But the reason I didn't kind of go after any of those was really the people at LinkedIn that I learned so much from in that internship that I was very excited to kind of come back and keep learning from those people. So it was really the people that kept me coming back.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the major things I've always heard, that the team is what always is like one of the most important parts.
Definitely.
So could you walk us through some of the technology and work that you do for LinkedIn?
Sure. Yeah. So like I mentioned, I'm a mobile engineer. So my main focus is iOS. So what that means is on a daily basis, I'm building iOS features for the main LinkedIn application. LinkedIn as a whole has a bunch of mobile applications, actually. There's the LinkedIn Learning app, there's the main LinkedIn app, right? There's also SlideShare, actually, is still on my LinkedIn. There's a number of others, like a Recruiter app, a Sales Navigator app. So there's mobile engineers spread out throughout the company. So I work specifically within the flagship organization, which supports the flagship app, the main LinkedIn application. That said, there's a lot of other stuff that kind of goes into my work, right? So it's not just pure iOS development. There's a lot of productivity work that I do as well in terms of making sure that everyone in the New York office is as productive as possible. That kind of actually started from an investigation I led about a year and a half ago, where we, as a company, do surveys constantly of what productivity is looking like and how people are feeling about their productivity. And one of those surveys showed the New York office taking a hit. And so that's where I was called upon to kind of look into it and see why. And since then, I've been pretty involved in improving productivity in the New York office. And then on top of that, I'm also part of a larger team, right? So while I work on iOS for the LinkedIn app, like that's not like the concrete thing that I'm doing, right? I work on iOS for the news and publishing team, which more concretely powers everything that you see in the LinkedIn application that's related to news. We have a huge team of editors around the world that produce content, that produce this news, right? And that put together various member stories and news stories to form these kind of rich news entities that are conversational and have a lot of depth to them. So my role is also improving that product experience by building more mobile features, but it's also what can we do in the back end, what can we do in our other systems to improve that as well. So I'm heavily involved there. And then lastly, one of the newer things I've been involved in the past couple of months, my team, News and Publishing, is part of a kind of larger organization called Content Experience. Content Experience is, as the name kind of implies, the experience of content on the LinkedIn application. And that kind of org is big, right? So there's 4 subgroups within that. One is like the main feed, which is, as you can imagine, a huge kind of source for content. The other is this team called Participate, which is all of the kind of social interaction around the feed. And then my team is actually called Ignite, which is all about igniting these conversations. And so that's where news and articles and publishing kind of come into play. But the 4th segment of that is video. And video is also based in the New York office, just like Ignite. And in the past few months, these 2 teams have kind of blended together, so to speak. We're not calling it a reorg per se, but it's essentially a reorg. And what that means, though, is I've also been involved in live video in the past couple of months, which, as you can imagine, in the current times is an up-and-coming product and is doing really well. And so that's also where more of my focus has been in the past couple of months.
Awesome. I mean, that sounds like a ton of fun, especially that bit about Ignite, that igniting conversations. I mean, even I worked there and I still didn't know exactly what Ignite did. So that's very helpful that now I know. So that's pretty cool. So you mentioned that you're looking into the productivity and stuff, and like I'm assuming those are the SAT scores or something.
Yep.
So one of the things that I guess like a question I build off of that would be, was that something that you did as a responsibility as a staff software engineer, or was that something you did as your own accord?
That's actually really, really interesting phrasing of that question, because it's not a responsibility that I had as a staff software engineer because I wasn't a staff software engineer at that time.
Okay.
That said, though, it was an opportunity that was given to me by my manager at the time that I grew into an opportunity that highlighted my work as a staff software engineer, if that makes sense. So basically, it was a small opportunity to investigate, a score that was lower than the rest of the scores. And I turned it into a much larger opportunity because I identified basically some key things that we could change that could help these scores and help productivity in the New York office. And so that initiative and that kind of growing of that opportunity and to impact for an entire office, that kind of was one of the big factors that brought me to my staff software engineer promotion, actually. It's not the only factor, definitely, but it was one of the big factors that definitely helped.
That's very interesting, actually. So now that once you became a staff software engineer, would you say it was different, or how would you say the role is different from the previous roles that you've done?
I think the biggest difference, and it's actually something I just realized this past week, which I thought was interesting. The biggest difference is basically that a staff software engineer is responsible for finding opportunities, whereas a software engineer and a senior software engineer, the 2 levels below, um, it's kind of assumed that they'll receive those opportunities from their management or from other engineers in their team, probably staff software engineers. But so that's where the role is different in that you have the autonomy and the kind of the trust put in you to go out and find opportunities for your team and for yourself that not just help the team and the product, but also help uh, like the individuals grow, right? So it's a multifaceted uh, thing that you have to kind of look out for, which is very different than kind of being given work from your manager or from others, right? You're much more proactively looking out for things that could improve your team's situation, that could improve your office's situation, or even that could improve someone's career, right? If you see an opportunity, if I see an opportunity, for example, that one of my teammates I think would benefit from, like it's my role now to really pass that along and make sure that they get that opportunity. Whereas as a non-staff software engineer, right, I would be expecting those opportunities and I wouldn't necessarily go and find them. And so I think that's actually part of the transformation that happens to get to that level is starting to find these on your own and really building that ability to find and disseminate and properly value different opportunities. Because that's one thing that is also not necessarily intuitive is that some opportunities may not be huge opportunities at the start, right? So like I mentioned with my productivity thing, at the beginning, it was just, why are these scores low? There was no mandate to fix it. It was just, can you give us a report of what's going on here? That said, I took that and ran with it, right? And I grew it into more than it initially was. And that's kind of the level that a staff software engineer is supposed to be at. It's supposed to be able to grow these little investigations if it's warranted, right? Like if I had discovered that there was no change we could have made, it would have been unwarranted to try and grow it, right? It wouldn't have made sense. But because there were positive things that could have come out of it, it was my responsibility to get those things to happen.
Right. Oh, that makes a ton of sense. And one thing I appreciate is that LinkedIn is a company where these staff software engineers are given the autonomy and, the respect and the trust that you guys can go out and do such a thing. So speaking about LinkedIn as a company, can you tell me a bit more about the company culture?
Sure. And I think you just kind of touched on it, is trust is a huge part of the company culture. And that kind of emanates at all levels. So when I'm looking at a code review, for example, from someone who's not on my team, right? I'm unsure about their intention, because LinkedIn's culture is so based on trust. I'm going to trust that they're doing the right thing, and I'm not going to worry that they're actually doing something nefarious, right? Which is, I think, a huge foundational piece that really is helpful in terms of getting work done quickly, because you trust that others are doing the right thing. Other cultural tenets that are really important is another one is ownership, which I think is um, kind of intuitively makes sense. But ownership at LinkedIn really means that whenever you do something, you should own it fully, right? So if you write some code and it causes a huge GCN, we call GCNs basically site down issues where a huge number of members are impacted, right? So if you cause one of those situations where you've impacted a lot of members and it's a bad situation, you're expected to own it. You're expected to look into what happened, fix it immediately, right? But then also after the fact, and analyze why it happened and ensure it won't happen again. And that kind of follow through is part of that ownership, right? Is really owning the problem and owning the solution. Um, LinkedIn's culture is also just about having fun, though, right? It's about enjoying your work, and there's a lot of kind of rest and relaxation built into LinkedIn's culture. Um, I know, Arpit, you know about this, but today's an in day, for example. So today is Friday. It's usually a work day, but I'm not working today because it's an in day. Once a month, we have this thing called in day, where and the theme rotates month by month, but basically it's a day for us to reconnect with whatever we want to reconnect with. They have themes to kind of help. I think today's theme is technically family. Um, but these are kind of part of the culture as well, to kind of give us time to really think about ourselves uh, as a a funnel, or not a funnel. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for? As a conduit for the work that we do, right? Like if we're not taking care of ourselves, then the work we do isn't going to be as high of quality. Um, and then what else is a key part of the culture? The last one actually that kind of comes to mind is uh, is kind of the results side of things, and that's very data driven. So LinkedIn's culture is very data driven. And a lot of startups and other companies say that, but they don't actually mean it. LinkedIn means it, in the sense that we could be building a new feature, and we all intuitively think, oh, this feature is amazing. But then we start looking at the data for the feature as it's being used by members, and if the data shows that it's not performing well, we don't follow our intuition, we follow the data. And that's not necessarily the case at other companies that I've seen. So that's another big part of it, is we trust the data. And not only do we trust the data, but we have a lot of effort put into our whole infrastructure for data. So data at LinkedIn is a huge, huge piece of that. And then the last thing, I guess, actually is just the people, right? So like I mentioned, um, the people is what brought me back to LinkedIn, and kind of open and honest, constructive dialogue is key to LinkedIn. And with that, mentorship is essential and is very powerful at LinkedIn. There's a lot of people who both give help and receive help, and that's an amazing thing to witness, because you see everyone kind of learning together. So I think that's the high level picture of LinkedIn's culture. But is there anything in there that you want me to dig into more?
No, I think that was actually a very, very great overall summary. I think that gives us especially a good idea, especially those of us who didn't have a good chance to work at LinkedIn or don't know too much about a company. I think they're able to see, especially the fact that this theme of the day is family, the theme of Indie, can show that LinkedIn is about connecting outside as well as being inside the company. And also, we just want to say thank you for reconnecting with your UPE family
Of
and
course.
and doing this podcast. And speaking of family, as you said, the people at LinkedIn, I'm sure they've become almost like a second family to you. and you've only had great things to say about the company, and clearly you're very satisfied with your experience there. Which brings me to my next question. Many of our viewers will be surprised to learn that you're also working as a software engineer at MySwimPro. So could you please tell us a bit more about that?
Of course, sure. So the philosophy behind having a side project is maybe where to start, which is, to me, I'm a big believer in the 10,000 hour rule and the kind of concept that you need to put in a lot of work to get to mastery. And so with that, I've always been interested, especially at the beginning of my career, to do a lot of work because that way I can get to mastery faster. And so that's why I've kind of always had a side project ever since I graduated from UCLA. My swim pro is actually kind of my second big side project I kind of can say, because I first joined this company called Go Viral for about a year and a half, and then was working on part-time for them. And I switched from them to my swim pro basically in May of 2017. The story of me joining my swim pro is actually pretty funny because so again, backing up one more second, at UCLA I played water polo, so I was on the D1 team actually for a year, and swimming and water polo is a huge part of my life. And so with that, I've been, I swim for conditioning for water polo. And so as soon as the Series 2 Apple Watch came out, which is waterproof, I started using it to track my swims. Quickly after that, the MySwimPro app came out for the Series 2 Apple Watch. And so I started using it. As a software engineer, as an iOS software engineer, I started reporting bugs because I noticed them, and there were a lot of them in that app at the time. And as I reported bugs, they accepted my feedback, said thank you, started to fix these things. But then I started reporting some more deep, kind of more foundational issues. And one of those led to, can we have a hangout to kind of discuss what's going on here a little more in detail? I think we did 2 or 3 of those hangouts, and then on a third one or so, towards the end of it, they were like, and they being the 2 founders, 2 of the 3 founders, actually, I should say. They were basically like, do you want to fix it for us? And so that's kind of where my role started there. So I started as basically, part-time iOS help for the main MySwimPro app. That was, wow, almost 3 years ago now, though. So the company has grown a lot since then. When I joined, it was the 2 co-founders I mentioned in the meeting and a third co-founder, and that was it. So I was number 4. So it was a very small operation. I think at the time there were maybe like 500 subscribers. We now have 12 people. It's a much larger company in relative terms, right? And there's now 10x the number of subscribers. So it's grown a lot, which has been really fun to witness. That said, I'm not working on iOS that much anymore. I'm actually kind of more focused on the data, which is an interesting connection to LinkedIn. So I basically own all of the analytics for MySwimPro at this point, and make sure that we track what we need to track, and then generate reports and kind of glean insights from the data that we have. And then on top of that, I actually also own the kind of admin portal that we have for ourselves, which is a web dashboard, which has a lot of different access to different things, which is built in React, which was a fun little side project for me, because I hadn't played with React before. But I still, am very involved in iOS, and I still work on the back end there. So I'm pretty much involved in all things software for MySwimPro. The little spiel about it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's a very helpful spiel. And I mean, yeah, because most people would be very surprised to and learn that, you're working multiple jobs, especially since being a staff software engineer at LinkedIn, I'm sure already is a time commitment. So the fact that you're splitting your time. But one thing that's unique, that since you are working these 2 companies, is you get to inadvertently see how the differences between working at such a large company versus this almost like, from the ground startup. So can you tell me a bit more about the differences from life at LinkedIn?
Definitely. And that's one of the reasons that I'm doing it, right? It's not just spending the time, it's also getting a broad set of experiences, which is very exciting for me. And comparing and contrasting is something that I can do forever, because there's so many differences at so many different levels. I think the top couple I've kind of touched on, but I guess to make explicit, the first one is what I work on, right? At MySwimPro, I touch everything software related. Anything that we have code for, I probably have a hand in. I mean, the Android app, I don't actually touch much, but I do make sure it's in sync with the iOS app. So I still am involved, right? At LinkedIn, that's not the case. I'm very limited in my scope and comparison. And for good reason though, because the limited scope has a much deeper set of problems. Whereas at My Swim Pro, the scale, I mean, and it comes down to the scale, right? My Swim Pro is growing, but it's only at on an order of tens of thousands of weekly members, right? If not a little less right now with pools closed around the world. That said, LinkedIn is on the order of tens of millions of members on a weekly basis. And so that order of magnitude difference is very much is very much kind of translated into the complexity differences in the software that powers those two systems. And so that's one of the first things I can see is like, you can see how complex the software is. And as a result, each individual engineer has a much tighter scope in the more complex system, because otherwise just too much. So that's the first kind of key difference I can kind of point out. The other one though, on the kind of flip side, is because it's less complex, you actually get to participate and own more of the picture. So at My Swim Pro, I get to be involved in pretty much everything, right? From how do we want to set up our onboarding flow, to how do we want to market this new subscription plan, to how do we want to redesign this UI, to how do we want to track this flow. Whereas at LinkedIn, tracking this flow, there's a data scientist that's probably going to tell me the right way to do that. I might have ideas, I can contribute to those ideas, but I'm not going to be the one that decides that. For what to build in the UI, like I might have input, but we have designers that tell us like exactly what we want to have, and that sync with the larger design group to make sure it's all aligned with the whole LinkedIn platform. MasterPro has the designers. We just do it ourselves and fudge it and see what works. For like marketing and how we want to market new subscriptions, at My Swim Pro, I'm pretty involved in that. At LinkedIn, we have marketing managers. We have specific people whose role it is to market new LinkedIn features to the public. And while I have input in that, in the sense that I let them know, when the feature I built is getting launched, when it'll be ready, when it'll be viewable, all that kind of stuff, and I can have input onto their strategy if I think they're doing something that's not right. They're really good at what they do, and so I usually don't, right? Like they're better at what they do than I would have been. So, and that's why they have that job. And so that kind of role specialization is a big difference. Another one that I think is interesting as well is hiring. So at My Swim Pro, I mean, right now we're not hiring, as you can imagine, we're in a tight situation. But when hiring is on, it's fairly informal, right? Like there's a couple calls that happen, and then the team kind of discusses in Slack and kind of goes from there. Whereas at LinkedIn, it's a very formal process, as you, I'm sure, have experienced. There's a recruiter phone screen, there's technical phone screens, there's a whole flow that everyone kind of follows. Yeah, I could go on and on, but there's a lot of differences between the two, but they're actually also very similar in a lot of ways, in the sense that, at the end of the day, I'm still writing code, submitting code for code review, getting peer feedback, and submitting that code. I'm still reliant on the Apple distribution system, right, in terms of the App Store and getting my app reviewed through the App Store. It's also the same general like coding environment, right? Like Xcode is the tool that all iOS engineers pretty much use. So the same tool in both situations. That said, there is some slight differences even there, right? So My Swim Pro, we use GitHub for all of our code review. At LinkedIn, we use ReviewBoard, which is a different open source tool. Funny enough, though, GitHub is coming to LinkedIn by the end of this year, which is very exciting. So that will soon be a similarity, actually. But the flow will be different, right? So at LinkedIn, we have this two-step review process where you first get someone to review from your team, and this is specific to the main LinkedIn application platform. So there's 4 different pieces to that platform: an API layer, Android, iOS, and web, right? So each of those 4 platforms have a platform group that help maintain consistency across the platform, because it's such a big set of code. And I'm a part of that iOS platform group. And so that's a second review step that at LinkedIn you have to go through. Luckily, people from my team get both steps in one with my reviews, right? So there's an advantage there for them. That's a small tangent though, but that said, at My Swim Pro, there's no 2 review step, right? Like in some cases, you don't even need any reviews because I'm the only one that owns that code. We try and do peer review on all things, but sometimes it's like, I don't have no, like, not for me, but for others, like they have no context on what admin code I'm working on or the data SQL magic that I'm doing, right? They have no idea of like what's going on there. And so they're just like check marking, like, yeah, he didn't like blow things up in this, right? Um, so there was a difference there. Uh, and then, I mean, I think the last thing is really just the difference in size leads to differences in how you work, right? So there's only 10 people or so in my swim pro. So there's only, you know, 9 others you can reach out to. You kind of know everyone. You have a pretty good idea of what everyone's working on. At LinkedIn, though, I mean, my team alone is more than 10 people. So I don't even have any clue as to what people on other teams are really working on. But what that also means is there's a lot of people that I can reach out to for help, for guidance, for mentorship that at my swim pro, those people just aren't there. And so that's one of the things that I see in LinkedIn as a huge benefit is being able to reach out to these senior folks that aren't on my team, that aren't even in the same office, but that because they're at LinkedIn and because of our culture and values are willing to help and coach me. Um, so those are the biggest contrast and compare points I can think of, but I'm sure there's many more if you want to dig into those.
Yeah, I mean, no, that's very helpful, and I think that you're one of the few people I know who's able to experience both a big company and a startup at the exact same time, and you're able to see clearly the again compare and contrast both, which actually brings me to one of my next questions as a follow up for a lot of our undergrads and even people who are newly grads when they're deciding if they would want to go to a big company or if they want to go to a startup. Do you have any advice or any recommendations for help to help them figure this out?
Sure. I think there's a couple layers there. So the first layer is really just what you're interested in. So if a startup really like the mission of that startup really drives you and really motivates you versus a big company, you're not really sure if you would be as motivated, you know, that is one strong signal to me to go for that startup because um, being passionate about what you're working on is a huge piece of it because if you're not passionate and you're not happy with what you're working on, your work is going to suffer. And not just your work, but you are going to suffer as well. And so I would definitely, that's the first kind of consideration I would give. The second one on the kind of flip side of that though is risk, right? A startup is riskier. And so it depends on your willingness to accept risk. Uh, at the current time, right, like that's probably a little less, right? Like your willingness to take risk is probably a little lower right now than it usually is. Um, and so that's where like you might want to take a little extra time evaluating the risk of the startup. I don't think all startups are inherently I mean, let me take that back. All startups are inherently risky, but I don't think that all startups are increasingly more risky in the current situation than they usually are, right? Depending on the sector, some startups might actually be less risky right now because their solution is in so much demand. So that's something to weigh in as well. And then related to that risk is compensation, right? At a startup, you're probably not going to be able to get the same kind of compensation that you are at LinkedIn, for example. When like I talk to my swim pro folks about what I make at LinkedIn, uh, and in a conversation to join my swim pro full time, right? In that kind of a conversation, you know, there's no way that they can match or even get close to the salary. I mean, my swim pro is not big enough, doesn't make enough money for that to make any sense. And so that's also a factor. But then on top of that, you know, there's the base salary, which is something that my support can even match. But then there's also the stock compensation, where at LinkedIn, I mean, LinkedIn is owned by Microsoft, so my stock compensation is essentially cash, right? Like the Microsoft stock is doing really well still, but even if it's not doing really well, it's a public company. So as soon as I receive my stock, I can sell it immediately, and I get the cash. So it is essentially cash. That said, right, I receive shares of my swim pro. I can't sell those. There's no market for those currently. And so that's also accepting risk in the sense that if the company were to fail in the future, all of this vested interest that I have in the company is for naught, right? And that's a risk. Um, what else? I think those are the kind of two biggest considerations. And I think the last piece of it related to your passion is also the people at the two companies, right? So if you're kind of deciding between a startup and a big company, like in one specific situation, do you have any connections to people in either of those companies? And do you see the ability to grow those connections and grow to other people? And so that's where in a startup you are a little limited, right? If the startup is only 20 people, you know, if you learn from all those 20 people, like who else are you going to look to? And that is its own little risk, right? It's an education or a learning risk in a sense. Um, that said, a big company, if its culture isn't grounded in open communication and mentorship to younger engineers and younger employees, then you might not even get that anyway. So there is a balance there, that it's not necessarily that a big company offers more mentorship. It's very company and situation dependent. But it's all factors that I think are very important to kind of consider. So I guess at a high level, it's what's your risk tolerance? Do you have a passion for the product in either case? And then do you see growth potential for yourself as both an engineer, but also just as a person, right? Do you see people that you would want to learn from? That would be my kind of top three, I think, for that.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. And one thing that you mentioned is one of the most important things is like you're learning, and clearly you've learned a lot from these teams and your experience at these startups. But many of your viewers would also be surprised to know that you're actually pursuing formal education as well at this current time. And you're pursuing a master's degree at Harvard, is that correct?
Yep.
So do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Sure. Yeah. So Harvard has, through their extension school, a master's program that you can do part time. And it's funny because I took the GRE actually at UCLA my sophomore and junior year pretty early, and did really well. And so I was like looking forward to using that. Harvard didn't need it, so it was kind of a waste. But I'll have to say, one of the things that I really like about the Harvard program is it's not an application-based program. So I didn't have to spend all the time that is required with applying to grad school and all that kind of stuff. You just start taking the classes, and if you get a B or above in the first three, you're in. And that to me was a much more logical system, in the sense that I knew I would do well in the classes. I wasn't worried about that, and so I knew I could get in. It's funny because if you think about it, right, at a higher level, as a business, that's a genius idea, because then folks who aren't uh, actually at the level they need to be at take these classes and fail, but they still pay the money to Harvard to take the class, which is like $3,000 or so per class. So Harvard is making money off of that in a very kind of intelligent way, because it exposes people to that level of education, and gives them a taste, but then also doesn't dilute the actual degrees. Um, and that said, is another benefit of why I'm doing it is that LinkedIn actually pays $5,000 a year as an education reimbursement. And so I am getting LinkedIn to kind of pay for some of this. All that to say though, the reason I'm doing a master's is just kind of genuine interest. I was always curious to kind of dig into some more of the data science realm of things. And as I mentioned with LinkedIn, I mean, that's a huge part of LinkedIn's business. And so I really wanted to get deeper into that. And on top of that, one of the things that actually a professor at UCLA told me a while back, um, was that we had a conversation around like a promotion situation where, let's say you and I are up for a promotion and you have a master's and I don't, and everything else is equal, right? You're probably going to get the promotion over me because you have that master's, right? And so for me, it was also kind of checking off that little box to kind of protect myself down the road in case I was ever in that situation. I actually don't foresee that situation ever really happening, but that was one of the reasons I kind of jumped into it. Um, and then the last piece actually of why I wanted to do it is the Harvard program is 10 classes, or the 10th one is essentially writing a thesis. And I had never written a full thesis in a kind of you know academic setting that of that level, right, at a master's level. And my fiance actually did her master's recently, and I helped her with her thesis. And it was kind of fun process to kind of see her go through, and something that I kind of wanted to do as well. So that was also the last piece of it. In terms of where I'm at, I'm actually very close to that thesis class. I have one more prereq before that thesis class, and then it. So I have two classes left in the master's program. So I'm very close now.
That's amazing. That's great to hear, and congratulations that you're
Yeah,
almost done
thank
with
you.
it. And one thing that's interesting that you mentioned that is I can't remember someone, but someone told me the exact same thing, which is why I'm actually considering one of the reasons I'm considering pursuing a master's degree about the if you're both up for the job and one of you, I mean, you're the same otherwise. Can you tell me which professor that was? Because I can't seem to remember.
Um, I forget his name. He was a visiting professor from France. He was a French professor.
Oh,
I don't know if he's still there. He was at the time just an associate, so he wasn't sure he would be staying there for very long. And he taught. I took CS33 with him, and he generally specializes in compilers.
was it
I don't know. Hope
Professor Gaffney? No.
not Gaffney. No.
Okay. All right. I guess yeah, just a visiting professor. Maybe his word stuck around and made its way down to us. So
Potentially.
yeah, I mean, also one thing I want to point out is clearly you've got a lot on your plate. I mean, you're working full time at LinkedIn. You have My Swim Pro. You have your master's education, and congratulations, you also have a fiance, which is actually a huge achievement in the software industry. So congratulations on that. And one thing I want to say is, how do you manage it all? You know?
Yeah, I get that question a lot actually because it's something that everyone around me is unsure about how I do it. I think it's the ability to focus, and it's also the ability to really manage my time in the sense that I am very good at turning things off in my brain, so to speak. So, uh, to give you a more kind of concrete example, uh, my day at LinkedIn is pretty much 8 to 4. At 4 p.m. rolls around, I'll still be online. I'll still have Slack messages coming in. I'll probably pay attention a little bit, but I'm not going to get into the weeds of it. And so, starting at 4, I'm basically offline for LinkedIn. And so everything that is important that comes in then, I'll just snooze it till the next morning for myself, right? So I don't actually actively think about anything for LinkedIn. So that means that starting at 4, I can focus on other things. And so I usually then immediately take a break and to do a workout or go cook dinner or walk my dog or something like that. Take a little break. And then around like 6 or 7, I'll go back and do some iSwim Pro or some Harvard. And that's another key point is I try and never do all 3 of those things in the same day. Because I did that in the past and my brain wasn't able to context switch deep enough to make progress in the different things I was trying to do. And so I really limit myself to 2 main things per day, whether that be plus relaxation. So the relaxation component, whatever it may be, TV, listening to a podcast, whatever it may be, right? That is always on its own kind of bucket. But then the 2 main buckets would either be, LinkedIn and Harvard, LinkedIn and My Swim Pro, or on the weekends, it's My Swim Pro and Harvard, right? And so that's another piece is I do work on the weekends. For me, it's not like I work the whole weekend, and I definitely still value my social time, and I like to go out. I like to party. That's not like I don't do those things. But I do make the most of my weekend time, especially the mornings, because, and this is again, all of these things are personal to me, and for each individual, they're going to vary. Um, but for me, I'm kind of a morning person. I do my best work in the morning, and it's kind of funny the way I think about it. It's kind of like a linear decline throughout the day of like how good my work is coming out, which I actually feel bad for my swim pro in the sense that during the week, my work is worse than on weekends, right? Because on weekends, I'm giving them my morning attention. During the week, I'm giving them my very late in the day attention, which is not as good. And I'm very conscious of that. And so I make an effort to not push myself as hard when I know that my attention won't be able to do the things I want it to do. And so that's another piece of it is kind of being nice to myself while still pushing myself, right? I'm very aware of when my productivity is starting to decline, and I have no hesitation to say, okay, I'm done for the day. My mind's not able to do any more work. I need a break, right? And that's where I think a lot of people get into trouble is they try and push through that. And that to me is not a way that you're going to succeed, because if you continuously try and push through that, the work that you do while pushing through that will be lower quality, and that will spiral for you. So I really try and avoid that. What else? Okay, and then the other piece of this in terms of like how I systemize all of this is I use an app called Things. I don't know if you've heard about it. I'm sure it's pretty popular out there. It's been at the top of the App Store for a while, but it's the way I keep track of everything I need to do. And so with that, anything that I'm going to do is in a work item in Things. And so I have a clear picture at all times of what I want to be doing that day. And then, curating that list for myself is also a big piece of it. So if in the morning I look and there's like 40 reminders and I know I'm not going to get through all of them, right? I've selectively moved things to the time that I know I'll be actually able to get to it. And so like proactively managing that and making sure that the things that are on the list I actually will get done today. Uh, and then actually getting them all done is also a huge kind of reinforcing cycle to make sure that I get everything I want to get done.
Wow. I mean, that's a very time efficient management that you have going on. I mean, especially considering a lot of college students are listening to this, they're like, wow, I don't do that much in my day. A lot of times I'm just laying in my bed and just, going on my phone. So it's good to see that you've gotten to a state where you're able to maximize your productivity while still having the most fun. So actually, let's talk a little bit about how you got there. So considering your time at UCLA and once you left UCLA, could you tell me something about like the biggest adjustment, challenge, or like the path that you took here? Because I understand you're an intern on LinkedIn, then full time, then I know you worked at some startups, and then background you had everything else going on. Could you tell us a little bit just more about your general path and adjustment?
Yeah, of course, of course. Um, so actually, we can start within UCLA itself, actually, because uh, so I started off, taking 4 classes a quarter, pretty much the whole time. But then my junior summer, I took a class over the summer to free up my last quarter. And so my senior year last quarter, I had 3 classes, and so that was really nice, very relaxing. And I think my last year at UCLA was definitely kind of like a break for me in the way I kind of thought about things. And so I was definitely not pushing as hard on all the things I was kind of talking about. Um, that said, though, and that was all thanks to the LinkedIn offer that I had, where I knew I was going to a full-time job as soon as I graduated, and so there was no real pressure there. And so that then went full-time to LinkedIn, and I was there for about a year in the California offices. And at that point, I was basically living in so my parents' house. They had just built a one-bedroom extension in the back, fully separate extension that's now actually being rented to various people as a side income for my parents. And so I like moved into that as soon as they had built it, and so that was a convenient way to live and not pay too much for rent, right, and kind of save up some money. But then after a year, my fiance, as I mentioned, went to do her master's, and that master's is actually in Scotland. So I moved to Scotland and Edinburgh specifically for about 15 months between let's see, 2016 and like late 2017, right? And and that was amazing. And so in Scotland, I wasn't working for LinkedIn, so I actually asked, 6 months before I knew I was going to leave, if there was a way I could work remotely for LinkedIn. Interestingly, my manager was like, if only you were moving in the US, we could have said yes. But because you're moving outside of the US, we have to say no. So that was fine. But she did say, if you're ever back in the US and want to work for LinkedIn again, give me a ring and we'll see what we can do. So I'll come back to that in a sec. And so then when I was in Scotland, I worked for a number of companies actually. So I first did some freelancing just because it actually took me a while to find a full-time job while in Scotland. Interestingly enough, the European software engineering market is very different than the US. And especially in Scotland, there just isn't that strong of a market. The biggest player in Edinburgh in terms of software is Skyscanner, which is a travel business, which is probably suffering deeply right now. And so I don't think I would have kept my job if I was there, actually, in hindsight. Um, that said, though, the only other big company that was there was Amazon. They had some engineering work, but not much. I applied to both of those, didn't really move forward fast enough for me. And so because of that delay and the no progress on other startups that I had started kind of reaching out to, I actually even got to the offer stage with a startup that they had to rescind the offer because the salary I was asking for was too high for them to kind of manage. Whereas to me, the salary was still much lower than when I had at LinkedIn just months before. All of that to say, I had to do some freelancing for a few months to just pay the bills. So during that time, I worked on this company's project called Aircarta, which was basically like a business card scanning type of app. I also worked with this company, or actually a research group at Stanford called Stroke Coach, which was a Apple Watch solution to help track stroke patients after they had a stroke and make sure they were doing all their kind of physical therapy exercises. And not just they were doing it, but doing them right. So there's a lot of data transfer between the watch and the phone, which is a fun project to work on for a few months, or not even a few months, a few weeks actually. And I also did some other freelance projects during that time. And then I was able to land a full-time position remotely with this company called Creatables. Creatables is a social network for kids, where it's essentially a learning platform for people under 13 to get familiar with social media and be ready for Facebook once they're 13, basically. Um, and that company was struggling for a number of reasons that I could talk about for actually a long time. But at a high level, they were trying to solve two huge problems, right? Social network for kids is a huge problem in terms of just how do you solve that, right? Like, how do you make a product that solves that works? And then also they were trying to do that remotely. And remote work, which is right now, pushed into the forefront, is still tough. And there's still a lot of work that goes into making that work. And so they were trying to solve those two big problems, which I think was one problem too big, too many. And so I worked for them for over a year. And during that time is actually also when I switched from Go Viral to My Swim Pro side project Live. And then basically in December of 2017, moved to New York. My fiance is from New York, so it was kind of moving home for her. And it was always the plan that we would move back to New York after we went to Scotland, because she had moved from New York to California to be with me. And so it was kind of only fair, right? And at that point, I asked Creatables for a raise because I needed more money to live in New York, basically. New York is a much more expensive city to live in than Edinburgh. I think I did some cost comparator tools online or whatever and showed some like 40 to 50% higher cost of living, which is definitely what I experienced. I mean, my rent now is 50% higher for an apartment that is the size of my living room that I had in Scotland. So it's very different in terms of cost of living. And so with that, I had to ask for a raise. Creatables wasn't interested in giving me a raise, though. They were actually struggling very, very mightily at that point, and were in a cost-cutting mode. And so me quitting was an easy way for them to cut costs. And so I left and rejoined LinkedIn. And that process was actually really fun because, as I mentioned earlier, right, my manager at the time had said, "Give me a ring if you want to come back." And so I did that, and she was very, very helpful. Basically skipped me through the recruiter phone screen and the the technical phone screen, and brought me straight into the on-site round of interviews, which is also kind of a fun formality at that point because I had given those interviews in the past, and so I knew those modules very well. So I aced them all, not because I'm such a good software engineer. I mean, I'm not bad, but because I knew what they were going to ask me. I knew the questions. I literally practiced the problem that they were going to give me the day before because I knew what it was going to be. And so that obviously went really well. And yeah, so that was in March of 2018. So, I moved back in December. So a few months of figuring things out. And then I joined LinkedIn in March, and then I've been there ever since. And in terms of like adjustments from UCLA, kind of circling back to that, I think the biggest one was really just kind of the immediate adjustment from living in LA to moving to California, or moving to Northern California back to my parents' house and starting to work full time. There was just an adjustment there in that, like, I had been relaxing for a year, right? And then I had to go back to work. And so that was a bit of an adjustment that, took a few weeks to really get back into the flow of being on most of the day as opposed to being off most of the day. But it was something that I was kind of ready for, right? It was something that I had expected, right? I had taken the kind of year off purposefully. It was my intention to do that and then kind of reactivate right after, right? So that was all part of my plan, so to speak. And yeah, and it kind of been on since.
That's great. That's actually very also encouraging to hear, because some seniors like myself can attest. I have been off much of the day, and I was worried. I'm like, will I be able to turn it on? It's great to hear that it takes a few weeks to readjust. So, but speaking a bit more about your life at UCLA, can you tell us some of your favorite CS classes and the ones that have been the most relevant in your time in industry?
Sure. So I was actually thinking about this the other day of what my favorite CS class was. And interestingly, I actually think it was a non-CS department class, but that I built software for, which was the Introduction to Entrepreneurship, or I'm not even sure if that's even the name of the class, but Management 160 or Management 161, which are kind of part of the management tech breadth options that you have. And one of those two classes is basically a lean startup for 10 weeks. You have a team, you build a product, and you have to launch it by week 10. And to me, that class was amazing because it forced me to build production, not production because it was a class, it's not really production, but kind of production style code that is shipped, that people see, that people are using very quickly. So that class was really fun. And luckily, I had another software engineer on my team, so it wasn't just me doing all of the work. But it was a really fun class, and it actually led me to then build a company. Very roughly, we didn't make any money. It was kind of just a fun little project, but really build a company out from that project. So the project was to build an app, right? And we built a website because in 10 weeks you can't get through app code review. So and you can't iterate on your app, right, in 10 weeks. So I built a web app, but then as soon as the class ended, I actually just transformed that into my original idea, which was an iOS app, and then worked on that for a little bit. In terms of like applications to kind of the real world, one class that definitely was a part of that as well, was actually similar in terms of the project structure, was CS 130, which we actually talked about a little bit. Kind of, it sounds like there's different formats for that class. Because so when I took it, it was groups of 5 or 6 where you choose your own project, which has to get approved by the professor in terms of the scope and complexity. But then once you have that approved, you just kind of work on that for a quarter. And my team essentially, it was funny because I actually kind of, my core idea going into that class was to take the app I had just built that I just mentioned for the other class and take the key things I thought were important from it and build a completely new product out of it. And so I was just hoping the team would consider that idea. It was the only idea presented. Everyone just ran with it. So I was stoked by that, but it was kind of funny that no one else really had any ideas there. So we just ran with mine. And it was a really fun class though, because it was a group of 6 engineers this time. It wasn't a group of 6 with 2 engineers. It was 6 engineers. So we were able to really push and really do a lot of cool stuff. So we ended up building a full app, launched in the App Store that had SMS integration, that had all these different pieces to it. That was really, really fun to work on. But more importantly, was also very similar actually to how the real world, how I work with my peers at LinkedIn in terms of assigning work, breaking down tasks, giving each other estimates for when you're going to be done because I rely on their piece or vice versa. So all of that was very, very applicable. Taking a step away from that kind of class though, there's some foundational kind of theoretical classes that I know that while I was at LinkedIn, I didn't necessarily see the benefit of, but in hindsight, there's definitely a ton of value in them. So some of those are like, I think it's CS 151B, the lab class, right? Where you're kind of working with digital circuits and things like that. I've heard many times now that people hate that class and that it's like, well, what's the purpose of doing this, right? Well, actually, that logical thinking at a low level, the logic gates, thinking through, okay, wait, what needs to happen to make this happen? That's software engineering. Like that's what you do at a huge distributed system like LinkedIn, right? It's essentially the same thing, except that instead of hardware pieces, you just have different services that interact with each other at a high level, right? And instead of just having zeros and ones going in between them, you have this very complex API that is much more than just a 0 or a 1, right? But it's the same kind of analysis. It's the same kind of thought process, the same procedure to figure out what's going on. And so that was one of the huge things that I found was valuable. But I also just thought it's fun. So I'm a software engineer, but I guess I'm a hardware geek. I love to like play with hardware and see how it works. And so to me, like that was also a huge value there, right? It was just kind of fun to play with the hardware. And then that is also another aspect that was like playing with hardware is something that is extremely valuable to a software engineer, and having that intuition of what's actually going on underneath the hood. And that's where I think UCLA education differentiates software engineers from a software engineer who didn't go to a school like UCLA or who didn't actually get a formal education, is our ability to understand the full stack. And I think that's critical to really get the most out of your stack, right? So if you're on an iOS device and you don't really understand what's going on below the iOS SDK, you can't optimize as well as you could if you do know the full stack. So that gives us opportunities to go much deeper and build cooler stuff, in my opinion, than someone who doesn't have that background. Um, Kind of back to your question more directly, another class that I think has kind of had direct input into my career in terms of the things that I use on a daily basis is CS 118 as well, the networking class. I mean, the internet is everything, right? LinkedIn is an internet business. Uh, but knowing how the internet works and knowing all the different pieces is not just interesting, it's also key to making sure that the work I do at LinkedIn works, right? LinkedIn is a huge system used around the world. There's data centers in multiple places, but as a company, we're actually moving to Azure, right? But okay, wait, how does that even work, right? Like, what does that even mean? How is all this traffic talking to each other, right? That class really gave me the foundation to understand all of that. And I can go through the list of all of our required classes. They're really all lead you to understand different pieces of these complex systems. And I know that looking forward from those classes is hard to see that. But I guess try and trust that looking back, the dots will connect because they definitely have connected for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's really great to hear, especially a lot of us don't know exactly how we're going to be applying these, but I guess the dots do connect. But one of the things is on the other side, you say that then, the curriculum is very helpful and great, but going into industry, do you have any recommendations for how it could be improved?
So that's where actually this kind of conversation is one of those things that I think needs to be more formalized and needs to happen at a bigger scale, right? So I think everyone should have this context of how these things can apply, and that's to me that what's missing is we focus so much on the foundations, and there are some small applications given in each of these classes, but the really big picture applications of these concepts aren't usually translated in our classes right now, at least from my experience when I was at UCLA. And so that to me is the biggest area for improvement. That said, right, taking the flip side, taking the professor perspective, right, like how do you teach, or how do you explain how your small concept, and not small because they're all very complicated actually, but your kind of your concept, right, how does it fit into the bigger picture to students who have not really dealt with the bigger picture, right? That's where it's tough, and that's where I'm not sure that professors have a good answer. And so that's maybe why we're in this state, right? Because kind of for me looking back, right, like if I had heard what I'm saying now, 7 years ago, I don't know how much of it I would have been able to trust, because I wouldn't have been able to kind of really see how it all really, like what it really means. And so that's where it's kind of a situation where there's a certain amount of trust that you need to place in the kind of institution, in the kind of program as a whole, and trust that as you kind of leave it and start really applying all the things that it'll kind of work out. And I think that as long as you really focus on doing good work and following your passions and applying what you know and what you've learned to your passions, then that's gonna happen for you kind of naturally.
No, that's very interesting. So, you speak of your passions and everything. Did you know, beforehand, what your passions were, and how did that translate into some of also the organizations and activities that you did at UCLA?
Yeah. So, I mean, I've wanted to do software my whole life. I wrote my first program when I was 13. I've been playing with computers forever. So that's been my core passion kind of forever. So that's definitely one piece of it. The other piece of it is, like we talked about before. I played water polo at UCLA. I've played water polo since high school. That's another big passion of mine, and that's where my those two passions have connected, right? My swim pro is a easy example of that connection for me, right? Intersection of multiple of my passions. Similarly, I've always loved video games, and so like I used to play a lot of World of Warcraft. And so like working on games is another thing that I enjoy doing. It's not something that I do a lot of, just because it's a very time-consuming area of software engineering. Graphics just take a lot of time, but it's something that I dabble with for fun, right? And that's something that down the road, I think it'd be fun to kind of produce an iOS game for funsies, for my own kind of fun, right? And potential side income, right? One of the small little side projects I'm working on right now is a, a tool to optimize fantasy football lineups. And so I love watching football. I love watching the NFL. And so that's another way that like, passions intersect, right? I'm building software for my other passion. Um, LinkedIn, I wouldn't say that social media is one of my passions, but, unlocking value for people, right? And kind of improving people's experiences in dealing with the internet is a passion of mine, because there's so much just garbage on the internet. There's so much trash, right? And LinkedIn is this nice kind of core of trust and professionalism that kind of stands in contrast to that. And so that drives me to really improve that platform and again, overlapping passions. Um, yeah, all that to say, there's a lot of different passions of mine that do kind of come into play. One other example actually that comes to mind now is, so I everyone loves to eat, I think, but I love to cook as well. I was born in France. I grew up with a French family. So I grew up eating a lot of good French food. So I love to cook French food. And so that's another area where I intersect software and food, is I'm also working on, and these are little projects that aren't taking a lot of my time. They're just kind of fun little hobbies on the side, but I am working on a kitchen app to like manage my pantry and kind of organize recipes and things like that. Right. And I've done that just to kind of see what I want, and I ended up finding an app that actually did close enough to what I wanted. So I kind of shelved that project for the time being, right? But all these kinds of little projects overlapping with different passions is I guess kind of an example of what you were kind of asking about, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting answer. So, for your main activities at UCLA, so you're basically part of the water polo team. And what other orgs can you tell me you were like a part of?
That was really it. Is the water polo was kind of its own little club that was my main my main org, so to speak. UPE was definitely part of it. I also joined, I forget the exact name, but there was a group that worked on video games within Volter. I forget the name of it, but I joined that group for a little bit as well. But yeah, no, my top focus was definitely water polo. I would say that there was also kind of a subgroup of that went to football games, right? Which again intersects with some of my other interests I mentioned. But at a high level, it was very much athletics based for me when I was at UCLA, which I know is different than most engineers.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a very diverse and interesting experience, especially to hear about and see how it has brought you here today. So, well, Ben, it has been a pleasure and amazing to have you on the show today. Do you have any last words for our viewers?
I guess just follow your passion, and UCLA will get you ready for that. That's all I have to say. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you again. Thank you so much, Ben, for your time and sharing your perspectives and experiences with all of us today. And thank you all for tuning into UP Podcast. We will be having more episodes in the future, so watch out for those when they are released. Please remember to stay safe, stay healthy, and wash your hands for at least 20 seconds. You got to keep it going. Got to make sure you get under your nails, everything. So I was your host, Arpit Jasapara, and keep up the grind.